very good afternoon to everyone. I'm truly honored to welcome you all to this session on gender budgeting. In a world striving for inclusivity and gender equality, this discussion couldn't be more timely or vital. Gender budgeting is not just a financial endeavor, it is a commitment to promoting fairness and justice in the society. In a broader context, it's about acknowledging that budgets aren't gender neutral. They have the power to either perpetuate or alleviate gender-based disparities. Today, we will explore the profound impact of gender-responsive budgeting, a concept that demands our attention and action. Gender budgeting ensures that government spending and fiscal policies are examined through a gender lens. It seeks to understand how different policies and allocations impact men and women differently. By identifying and addressing the specific needs and challenges faced by various genders, we can create a more equitable and just society. For this, we would like to invite none other than Professor Lekha Chakraborty. Ma'am is a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi, which is a research institute of Ministry of Finance. She is an elected member of the Governing Board of Management, International Institute of Public Finance, Munich. She is a pioneer economist in institutionalizing gender budgeting in India with Chief Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, Government of India in 2004. She is also a research affiliate at the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College, New York. She's the recipient of Infosys Best PhD Thesis Award from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Ma'am has worked for various international institutes of repute like IMF, ILO, the World Bank, UNDP, UN Women, and so on. Her work experience on macro-fiscal policy and human development spans across 8 countries and more, including Sweden, Canada, Morocco, the Philippines, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Mexico, and more frequently in the South Asian or Asian Pacific region. Ma'am is She was twice an awardee of the Shastri Indo-Canadian program from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Government of Canada. She's been visiting professor at various foreign and Indian universities, delivering lectures like at the London School of Economics, American University, Carleton, Canada, and the University of Utah. She has papers in several national and international journals. Ma'am is a columnist for the Indian Express, the Hindu, Financial Express, Business Line, Business Standard, The Wire, Hindustan Times, Money Control, and Scroll, and features in Forbes, CNBC, ANI, DD News, Air World Service, and Rajya Sabha. I can go on with Ma'am's introduction, but I will restrain myself and let Ma'am talk about the topic that we have for today, that is gender budgeting. With this, I would now request Lekha Ma'am to please take on the dais.
Thank you
so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Niharika, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for, so much for that warm introduction. And it's my privilege to get back to the Symbiosis School of Economics. And I think this is the 3rd time. And a special thanks to Jyoti ma'am. She connected me and Niharika, and we could do it today. Students, when I talk about the gender budgeting, this book I have recently written, it's by Palgrave Macmillan. Its title is Fiscal Policy for Sustainable Development in Asia Pacific, Gender Budgeting in India. So this is a reference, and take a look at this book, and along with that, take a look into my paper in IMF. It's titled Gender Budgeting in Asia Pacific. It was a big survey, a regional survey, and I was leading the gender budgeting project for IMF from the Asia Pacific. So these are my references, because Niharika asked me, ma'am, do you have PPT? So otherwise you have to write notes. No, you don't have to write notes right now. I will be sending the link of this book to Niharika ma'am, and she will share it with you. Now, when we talk about gender budgeting, we have to take it in the context of polycrisis. That's the frontier research happening right now. A polycrisis, in the sense, we have to take the gender budgeting context against a backdrop of war, against a backdrop of the climate crisis, also the debt restructuring and the energy crisis. So we need to look into this question from the polycrisis perspective. And Adam Tooze of the Columbia University, he's a professor who effectively argued and meticulously researched on this topic of polycrisis. Recently, there was a big conference in ODI, Overseas Development Institute in London, where my former boss Ratan Roy is a managing director of ODI. He invited me to participate in that meeting. So there we have taken the climate crisis question quite a bit, but that's the next step we need to look into against the backdrop of this polycrisis. So having said that, this book is written prior to the polycrisis. The terminology or that research got attention very recently. This book was published in 2022. So it's like a 1-year-old book, but still it's highly relevant in terms of its contents related to the expenditure design, the taxation incidents, intergovernmental fiscal transfers, and also looking into the benefit incidence analysis. Taking ahead the sector health. So these are the broad contents, but there are many chapters. But let us unpack it one by one. Gender budgeting, it's a fiscal innovation. It is a public financial management tool. When we look into this gender budgeting, we need to understand that it needs to be looked into from an ex-ante perspective and ex-post perspective. Ex-ante means we are getting a space where we can formulate by identifying the gender needs and then costing it and then get into this budget. But ex-post means whatever is existing in the budget. You open the budget document, whatever is existing in the budget, you need to apply a gender lens and take it ahead. And you have to articulate how much our country is spending for women. That's a way we need to look into from the ex-ante and ex-post. Now, any question we need to look into using an analytical framework. So what could be the plausible analytical framework to look into the question of gender? So let's take the capability deprivation framework of Amartya Sen. That's a proper, a framework in which you can take the question from an ex-ante perspective. Amartya Sen's capability deprivation, it has 3 layers. The first layer is the capabilities, the second is the functionings, and third is commodity space. So in the capability space, you need to articulate what are the rights, because it's a rights based, it's an entitlements based PFM framework. So what are the rights? The right to live, right to have a healthy life, right for education, right to have proper mobility, right to have bodily integrity. So there are many rights. So you understand those capabilities and list it, and you can take a look into Professor Lord Meghanath Desai's that working paper in London School of Economics, where he articulated this capability deprivation framework for the poverty. So he looked into this question of the capabilities, functionings, and the commodity space for poverty. So we can take that framework for the gender budgeting question. So students can take a look into that LSE working paper of Lord Meghanath Desai. Now, the capabilities, as I mentioned earlier, you list the capabilities or you list the rights. Now, functioning is observed data. So how much of this capability is transformed? To understand that, you observe the data, gender disaggregated data for education. The right to health means you need to look into the health indicators, right to mobility, right to have bodily integrity. There are many things you can map from the capabilities to the functionings. So once you do that, you will understand the data gaps. So this gender diagnosis is an important prelude to design a gender budgeting. So once you understand these gender gaps, once you do this diagnosis exercise, now the third layer is your commodity space. And when we talk about the PFM, the fiscal policy, your commodity space is a fiscal policy space. So that's the way Lord Mekhnad Desai has articulated Amartya Sen's that capability deprivation framework or capability and functionings framework. I think today's Amartya Sen's birthday. I think I have seen in heard his daughter tweeted about Baba happy birthday with her photo with him. I think so. I think today's Amartya Sen's birthday. Okay, so taking this capability framework, how we can do an ex-ante gender budgeting is one analytical framework with which students can take a look into. Now, exposed framework is everything is given. So you look into the existing budget through a gender lens. So you open the budget document, you understand that a government designed so many specifically targeted programs for women. So you map those specifically targeted programs for women across the sectors. So once you map that, identify the magnitude as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of the entire budget, how much is that country or a state or a third tier is spending on women. So over the years, we have understood that the part A of the gender budget statement, which looks into the specifically targeted programs for the women, that is only around 1% of the entire budget. So are we talking about this 1% of the entire budget as your gender budgeting? Not at all. The rest of the 99 or the 99% of the budget you need to look into through a gender lens. And do we have enough methodologies to look into that 99% of the budget through a gender lens? These were the questions. And of course, there are part A and part B to the gender budget statement. And gender budget statement is only one methodology among many to look into the gender budgeting question. So now, how do you apply a gender lens to the 99% of the budget? There are many public expenditure which has intrinsic gender components. So how do you look into that intrinsic gender components? So that's quite an ad hoc and arbitrary manner that the sectors give you the estimates that this is a way, intrinsically we apply a gender component within the mainstream spending. So it's very tough to get that data. That's an administrative data where we don't have any direct access, but researchers have asked the sectoral ministries to provide that when they do the gender budgeting. In the gender budgeting statement, which is opened in that masculine document called the Expenditure Budget Volume 1, you get that gender budgeting profile. So the Volume B is the detailed demand for grants across the sectors in which you get the aggregate allocation of the sectors. So you take a look into that ratio. Aggregate sectors ratio, how do you calculate from the detailed demand for grants? You get the total budget of each of the sectors. From the gender budget document, you get that part B, what is the component of the women or the women's component within the departments or within the mainstream spending, so you can understand the magnitude. But over the years, if you look into the total magnitude of the gender budgeting in our country, researchers are quite, worried about that because it's stagnant. It's around 5%. Why so? These are the questions asked. Then you need to take a look into the overall macroeconomic framework of our country or macro fiscal framework of our country. We have a fiscal rule. That is 3% of the GDP, our fiscal deficit. So within this fiscal rule, you need to ask a question related to gender budgeting and its magnitude. And how do you attain that fiscal consolidation, that 5% of GDP? You can take two paths, right? One is the tax buoyancy path. Tax buoyancy path in the sense, when the taxes are buoyant, you need not compress your spending. You can contain the deficit to 5% of GDP. But in post-pandemic era, the revenues are uncertain. So you need to take a look into the expenditure side and what are the components in the expenditure budget in which you can take a compression or you can cut. So expenditure cut, if that path is taken rather than the tax buoyancy path, then the human development related or gender aware human development related financing will be cut. In the sense, the social sector budget will be cut. A lot of compression happens on the expenditure side that affects gender budgeting. But despite all these fiscal rules or fiscal Management and Fiscal Legislative Act, the Fiscal Responsibility and Management Budget Management Act, we have the legislation on board to keep the fiscal deficit to GDP at 5%. Despite all these things, what happened? We are getting a stagnation, or we are getting a stagnant gender budgeting. So it's not, increased or decreased, but there is a hitch. We cannot compare the gender budgeting allocations across year. Why so? Because the demand for grants getting into the gender budgeting statement in the year 2005 and the demand for grants that got into the gender budgeting statement in 2023, they are different. And in between, a lot of convergence have happened. Lot of allocations we are unable to track. It's getting into the umbrella scheme. For instance, we had that Beti Bachao Beti Padhao, that good scheme to save the girls and educate the girls. It was a flagship program. It was an ex ante because we budgeted it. Gender budgeting is a promising framework in which we can come up with the programs and budget it. We have done that, but now this is within that umbrella scheme, and we are unable to track the spending. So these are the ways in which, when you compare across years, you need to understand that these demand for grants are not strictly comparable, but we get an overall sense that what is the ratio of gender budgeting to total budget in this year and T-1 or T-n year. So that's a way we look into. Now, what is a strong or the effective methodology to be applied for understanding the gender budgeting, or to apply a gender lens in the 99% of budget? Because as I mentioned earlier, 1% of budget, it is, it's easy to calculate because these are specifically targeted programs for women. There, public expenditure benefit incidence analysis is an important methodology, and that looks into the unit cost and the unit utilized. Unit cost in the sense that for education, for instance, if you have a program, you need to do a unit costing of the program. Then unit utilized, you get into this data by the large scale surveys and understand that how much it is utilized, that spending. It is like the distributional impact of a public spending, or the benefit incidence or the benefit capture of a public spending is analyzed through this benefit incidence analysis. It's a good methodology, public expenditure benefit incidence analysis, and this can be done across income quintiles, this can be done across socioeconomic groups. So that's a way we look into this question of the distributional impacts. Because gender budgeting is a tool of fiscal transparency. So you have a gender budget statement, that document is there, that's a fiscal transparency. Now comes the question of accountability. So transparency is the first step to get into this accountability question. So it's a wonderful tool of accountability. Now, as a fiscal innovation, how we reached accountability, it passed through many stages prior to the accountability. Like when we floated it in 2000, NIPFP was a pioneering institute to look into this question of gender budgeting. And that time, it was quite a messy thing that Finance Minister could not connect to gender. Finance Ministry asked us for numbers. Because it's not a storytelling, but of course gender budgeting is both qualitative and quantitative methodologies. Like one woman, her compelling story is worth running millions of regressions. So we need to get into, some students are very comfortable with the qualitative methodology, some students are comfortable with running regressions and coming up with numbers. And gender budgeting experts need to know both the quantitative and qualitative methodologies. And quantitative methodology, the question which was asked, that like the question, growth versus public policy, that's a debate. Now, UN Secretary General has asked us to go beyond the GDP, like we have a beyond GDP paradigm there. In growth coefficients and the public policy related coefficients we need to compare in the econometric model, in the sense human development or gender development, gender aware human development is a function of growth, public policy variables, and then many things. And you have that error term. Econometric students know that there's a stochasticity when you run the models, in the sense in physics, like 2 plus 2 is 4. That's a deterministic model. But in econometrics, you have an error term controlling for the surrogate of the omitted variables. Then what's the relationship between your human development and growth and public spending? So that's a way that human development is a function of growth, public policy variables, other control variables. Then you have the error term. So then you got an answer that the coefficients related to the economic growth and the coefficients of public expenditure related to education, health, gender budgeting, when you compare this, all the coefficients are positive, meaning 1% or 1% increase in the public expenditure or gender budgeting components or economic growth, you're going to get a positive relationship. The positive, HDI, which we proxy the human development, that's going to go up. So that's a way it's related. Human development is a function of economic growth, public expenditure related variables, including gender budgeting, and your surrogate term, that stochastic error term. So if you are getting an answer that the coefficients relate to gender budgeting, public spending related to health and education are relatively higher than economic growth, because everything is positive, prima facie I'm talking about, but you can test it. You have to test this hypothesis and theories. Then you can take a call that it's economic growth that is getting perfectly translated into human development. You need conscious public policy decisions. There's a role of public policy to translate into human development. So that you can run cross-country models, you can run cross-state, across provinces you can do a model. So across districts, the unit of analysis differs. But you need to prove that the coefficients related to the public expenditure to financing human development or gender budgeting has got relatively greater impact on the human development than the economic growth per se. So there's a case to go beyond that. This is one way which we articulated. The second analytical framework is, as public policy makers, when you visualize yourself there, will you be taking a route of equality? Equality in the sense, equality in processes and equality in outcome are different. There may be equality in processes that you don't discriminate anybody, but equality in outcomes, if you look into the numbers, that's simply not there. So you need to take a call that it is equality or equity, in the sense, if you believe that equality, that does a wonder, like schools, hospitals, everything you can come and access equally. There is no discrimination over there. But the benefit incidence analysis across quintiles, across income quintiles, across socioeconomic groups, if that's giving us a clue that it's not equality that is getting translated, but there are many logical entry barriers. So what's the public policy decisions you need to take that the people are not vulnerable or the people are not beyond that entry barrier or beyond that threshold? Why the people are vulnerable? Then United Nations and many forums, they started believing in leave nobody behind related public policies. So gender budgeting is floated from that perspective. It's not from the economic growth perspective, that there are entry barriers, there are unfreedoms. People are unable to come and access education and health equally. So what's that public policy which we need to formulate or design in our country so that men and women, girls and boys can come and access it equally? There are no unfreedoms, there are no entry barriers. So what is that public policy? There, the role of gender budgeting is quite crucial. So we flowed the gender budgeting from that perspective of removing the unfreedom so that people can come and participate in the economy equally. There, you need to take a look into the measurement issues. GDP, that is not exact measure to capture the human development. You need to look into the question, what captures human development, what are the measurement issues? So we have human development index, which gives, that's an arithmetic mean, now it's a geometric mean since 2010. So we look into education, health and income. we are giving equal weightage to these three variables and construct an index. Of course, there are a lot of technical difficulties or technical issues related to that index. It's not a perfect composite index because a lot of dimensions we cannot capture. But Amartya Sen and Mehboob Haq, then when they formulated this index in 1995, they took a call that from the infinite choices and infinite decisions, we will give priority to education, health, and income. So that's the way it was getting formulated. That's fine. Now, it's a gender neutral index. So when you do these models and all, HDI, if you proxy for the human development, that's a gender neutral index. And then I mentioned that you can take the growth variables, you can get into the public policy related variables, then other variables you can control, and then you can do the regressions, or you can do whatever by getting into the unit root, the pretest unit roots, integration, co-integration. You look into that because the stationarity of the variables at the same level are very important before you run the regressions. Otherwise, you need to correct it. You will learn all these details when you take the econometric classes, and then otherwise, if your variables are of different levels of integration, then you have very, very specific methodologies like Todo Yamamoto's that econometric paper, where order of integration and order of lags, and we got into that model. Or you can take a look into the Me-Boot analysis by Rishikesh Vinod, and that's a short-term time series analysis. And it also look into the question where if the variables are integrated of different order, how do you take the question ahead? It's like, short time series, if you are asked to look into the question of the gender outcomes and the gender budgeting, it started only in 2004 or 2005, and you have 2023 now, but the number of years are not sufficient to run a meaningful regression, because the years, at least 40 or 50 years, that would have been fine. But how do you look into the questions of gender budgeting's impact on gender outcome when your time series itself is limited? So there are ways in which you can overcome these difficulties, and what this Me-Boot, maximum entropy that bootstrapping or the ensembles methodology, what it does is, you're limited that variables, like if it is 30 years, you create ensembles. Ensemble is like reincarnations, and then it comes to 999, and your coefficient, your new beta, and this confidence interval in which your new beta is looked into, that's from this 999 ensembles or the reincarnations you created. It's a beautiful way in which you can overcome the short-run time series related issues. So these are the things you will learn when you go ahead with your advanced econometric classes. So once you look into this methodological difficulties and you overcome that, you take a call, that regression, look into the coefficients, and you find whether there is any relationship between gender budgeting and the gender related outcomes. These are the questions scholars asked. And one paper I mentioned about my IMF paper, another paper by Janet Stotsky, she looked into this question of what is the impact of gender budgeting on the gender outcomes. So she looked into the disparity of gender in the education sector, and she created the dummies. She looked into the states of India where the gender budgeting was introduced. So she took a dummy like budgeting states and non-budgeting states. She created dummies, and then she looked into this question of growth versus gender public policy related variables, incorporating this gender budgeting variable as a dummy. So is there any other way in which you can create a model other than doing a dummy? Then you have to get into this gender budgeting statements, get the allocations related to the gender budgeting, and you can proxy it even with the public expenditure allocations related to the gender budgeting. So there are different ways in which you can start asking the question of impact of gender budgeting on gender outcomes. Now, Janet Stotsky learned about the education sector. Another important study by the University of California, they looked into the question of impact of gender budgeting on gender-based violence. So there was an inverse relationship in which, the gender budgeting and the gender violence, that's inversely related in the sense the state machinery protecting women, that's happening through the gender budgeting, then the violence against women, that decreases. That's called the inverse. It's a negative relationship. Higher the allocations or higher the importance given to the gender budgeting, your violence against women, that's coming down. And there are different channels in which this relationship can be explained. And one channel, of course, state machinery supporting women through various methodologies, that can lead to the incidence, a decrease in the incidence of violence against women. So then another study by Janet Stolsky, myself, and Piyush Gandhi of Oxford University, we looked into the intergovernmental fiscal transfers question and its impact on gender outcomes. So how the gender budgeting gets into this, intergovernmental fiscal transfers? That's an important question because we are talking about the subnational government's fiscal space. When we talk about gender budgeting, it's not only at the top level. We need to look into the principle of subsidiarity and get into the subnational fiscal space. Now, there are two kinds of IGFT transfers, this intergovernmental fiscal transfers. One is conditional, the other is unconditional. Conditional transfers in the sense you design the specifically targeted or specific purpose grants to be given to the states by the center. Then what exactly is, your unconditional transfers? That is, you get into that the scientific formula, like the center gives the funds to the state governments based on a scientific formula. What is that formula? The formula is like based on population, area, the climate change considerations, tax effort, demographic transition, and of course the distance variable. That is the distance of your state from the the highest per capita income state. That's because economic convergence is an important issue of IGFT. Because when we look into the question what holds our country together, it's of course institutions, federal fiscal institutions, and Finance Commission has got a major role. And you know that 16th Finance Commission will be there very soon. The TOR will be announced very soon. That's about the 16th Finance Commission. This is November. So if by TOR the climate change consideration that got into the Finance Commission since 13th Finance Commission. So I'm asking you a question. If climate change can be the part of the Finance Commission or the IGFT framework of our country, why can't we talk about the gender within the IGFT framework? So we don't know the next commission whether a woman member will be there, whether they will be talking about gender within the IGFT framework. These are the questions which we need to look forward. But the climate change is beautifully articulated. The ecological fiscal transfers, that is beautifully inculcated into the Finance Commission framework. Now, conditional transfer is okay. We design certain grants or certain transfers specifically targeted for a program. Unconditional transfer means we need to incorporate a criterion relate to gender or relate to climate within the IGFT formula. And are we ready to do that? That's a question you need to ask. If you look into this formula, population, area, tax effort, these are very neutral indicators, but socioeconomic backwardness and climate, that's going to be a revolution. But of course, ecological fiscal transfer is getting captured through net forest car. We give weightage to the net forest car. So we need to look into the question where gender related variables can be the part of Finance Commission. Now, the students can be, debate on, you can debate on this issue. But if you say yes, then you need to ask a question how to proxy, which variable we need to consider. I mentioned about Human Development Index. So if it gets into, of course, that's a gender neutral index, but the practitioners always look for a simple indicator rather than a complex index like Human Development Index. So construction, that technical details, bureaucrats and practitioners may not be interested in. So you need to take a call to incorporate simple indicators. Like if you look into the gender, the same question. You have a composite index, gender development index, that is like you do a harmonic mean of this HDI by giving weightage to the population, computing the male and female components, you get a gender development index. Do we want to put that measure of gender outcome into this IGFT framework, or do we want to keep the formula very simple by incorporating simple indicators like if you incorporate MMR, that's maternal mortality rate, or such questions where the students can come up with what could be a good proxy. So how do you want to do that? That's entirely it's your decision whether to keep it simple or whether to keep it complex by incorporating the GDI or GII or the measurements like that. That we need to take a call. Now, after taking a call, whether it's simple or composite, you need to add the weightage to that formula, and then based on that, the states will be given the funds. If you take a decision that, okay, 20% or a 12% weight to that along with the other variables. So, are we ready as a country? Are we ready to look into this question to incorporate the gender related variable into the IGFT framework? It was a huge debate. Economists debated, and on one side, economists, they articulated that the Finance Commission transfers, it's not to look into the questions related to gender, it's to offset the fiscal disabilities across jurisdictions, and it talks about the cost disabilities. Then we can ask a counter question: how come over the years you incorporated climate change by mandate, by TOR? How come that happened? If climate can be in, why can't the human development? So that's a counter question. Then you will be given an answer that no, climate change means we look into from cost disabilities perspective, like the net forest cover. If it's if the state decide with the ecology versus economy question, if the state is going ahead with that, there is a cost to it. So cost disabilities, if you have to maintain the forest, so we give funds based on cost disabilities. Then we have to frame an argument about the human development, whether that's a cost disabilities. Of course, if the fastest and smartest way to increase your GDP is to improve female labor force participation, that's a huge army which is which is there to be tapped. That potential needs to be tapped. But women are not on board. That female labor force participation rate is very low, and we are not looking into such questions of the care economy infrastructure. Why this insights? Why the talents? Why the diversity on board? When you have educated, passionate women, but they are unable to work because of time poverty. This time poverty affects income poverty. Then you look into the time use statistics, which is a very new kind of it's a fashionable or a new kind of a statistics which you look into to understand the chronology of the time, but it gives hard numbers related to the poverty, the time poverty. Unless you look into the time poverty, how do you estimate the income poverty? These are connected, and this research happened and you can take a look into the Levy Economics Institute's website to get into these questions related to the unmonetized unpaid sector. So these are the questions. So you tackle this. You've identified the statistically invisible care economy, and you give importance to the care economy infrastructure so that the time that is locked that can be released and the women can participate in the economy to earn an income. Otherwise, the time poverty that's affecting the income poverty. Now, we have a lot of employer of last resort policies in our country, like we guarantee jobs. But if you look at the incidence of the guaranteed jobs, of course, by legal mandate, otherwise it's a public interest litigation, right? Like if you are guaranteed jobs and if you're unable to give jobs when the people come and ask, then it's a public interest litigation, and it has got a beautiful legal framework. But gender budgeting, that we need to identify a legal framework for gender budgeting. So far, the gender budgeting is not legally mandated. So do you want to get into that the public interest litigation mode, or you need to go Korea way? Korea, they incorporated the variables or the clauses related to gender budgeting within the national financial law. Or you want to go through that Filipino route. Philippines, they identified gender and development budget by earmarking a certain percentage of the gender within the developmental sectors. So do you want to go through that earmarking? But earmarking is, of course, a second best methodology of gender budgeting. because earmarking can be taken up as an upper bound, and the mainstreaming of gender budgeting within the public expenditure may not happen. So these are the issues which you need to work out. So I mentioned that it is a fiscal innovation, and before getting into the accountability, we started with knowledge building, and as I mentioned earlier, we started with a specific macroeconomic model building, and after getting into this models, knowledge specification, everything, you get into the next phase, that any beautiful research needs an institutional design. Institutions matter to translate that research into a public policy imperative. So, as an economist, as a young economist, when I joined an IPFP, that blank slate is in front of you to design gender budgeting, because that time, I tell this to my students, like, I joined in IPFP, and the first project given to me was gender budgeting, and that time, nobody could connect to this project because it's a new project. So it was like a weird project. It's not a star project, but I always tell my students that there is no project called star projects, and if you want a people mattered budget initiative, you put your soul into it and you can do a people mattered public policy. It's not like prima facie, like huge projects like intergovernmental fiscal transfers, finance commission, tax, those questions are star projects. But if when you study gender, it's not a star project. It's nothing like that. But there is a kind of negative look towards gender in macro policy, just because you're unable to connect to gender as a macro issue. So that was a major revolution, and there was an international working group on the international working group on gender, macroeconomics, and international trade. So we have quite a bit of papers where scholars looked into gender as a macro policy. So you have to give priority for gender. In many countries, in Pacific Islands, in Australia, the gender is at the top, place in the national building, like at the cabinet level or at the PMO level. It's at the top, that, or the president's decree in the Pacific Islands. So this importance, the political will or the importance given to this subject was huge. So that took little time. As a young economist, I had a lot of confusions when I was given the work on gender, when I was doing my PhD research on the impact of deficits. I was studying the macroeconomic impact of deficits on interest rate, which I wrote a book, that Nivedita mentioned that I wrote that book prior to this gender budgeting book. So I was getting confused that, but we are getting a space, to look into new questions. Then, slowly a new project unfold. It is a fiscal innovation. So fiscal innovation means any innovation, it will not get stuck at the knowledge building level. If you identify proper institutional building or institutional mechanisms, this research can be translated into public policy imperative. So that was the next question, and Ministry of Finance came up with the budgetary classification. There was a committee which looked into this question. What are the institutional mechanisms and what are the analytical matrices you need to design for your country to translate this gender budgeting related research into a public policy? So as students, you need to take a call that our contributions to our country, it should not stop at the level of international publications. You need to ask a question that our paper, our research paper, how it can be contributed to our country, that people mattered budget initiatives, and what is that contribution from the public policy perspective. So some students may get into the public policy schools in London School of Economics or in Harvard Kennedy School. So that will be their call. So you can look into these questions from different angles. That's the second phase, into innovation. You're getting from knowledge building to the institutional mechanisms. Now, capacity building. States' capacity is very important to translate a new project into, that people mattered public policy initiative. You need to get the results. So state capacity, a lot of capacity building program happens at the third level. Then, as I mentioned earlier, you need to ask about accountability. There is a hitch. Finance minister can announce many things. Fiscal councils are the watchdogs. They ask the question whether these promises are translated into real thing at the implementation level, are women getting benefits? So this question is relevant, and we have methodologies to look into that. We call that as fiscal marksmanship. Fiscal marksmanship relates to this budgetary forecast errors. If you have forecasting errors, then what you promise and what you deliver, there's a difference. Your marksmanship is not perfect. How do you get into this analysis? Why your marksmanship is not perfect? You need to ask this question to the finance ministry and the other sectoral ministries. So you get an answer that, of course, it is beyond the purview of a minister, purview of the finance minister. These are randomness. Random factors can affect your arithmetic, your fiscal arithmetic. So it's a beyond the capacity of your models, your assumptions. So that can be one answer. The other answer is like there's a bias. The way you project the models, the way you formulate your assumptions. If there is an issue, then that's because of the bias. So fiscal marksmanship, that can happen, that deviation between what you promise in the budget estimate state and when it comes to the revised estimates and the actuals, if there is a deviation, the reasons could be dichotomized. One could be random, that's beyond the purview of the policy makers. But if it is bias or if it is due to variation, you need to ask the question how it can be revived, how it can be revised. So gender budgeting, just like any other macro fiscal parameter, you can look into gender budgeting related variables to understand this fiscal marksmanship. And of course, many times it's random. But certain variables like intergovernmental fiscal transfers, especially grants, tax projections, capital spending, these are the variables in which you capture that it's due to randomness. You can take a look into that NIPFP work done by the former director of NIPFP, Professor Lekha Chakraborty, myself and Rusail Shrestha. We have done this work. You look into each states, look into the fiscal marksmanship issue. But overall, we got the inference that intergovernmental fiscal transfers, that grants or the fiscal transfer from the center to the state suffer. That affects the fiscal space, because if you don't have enough fiscal space and flexibility of finances at the subnational government level, how do you do the policy prioritization? Then capital spending. Then we ask the question why the capital spending is showing a lot of non-randomness in the fiscal forecasting errors. Then it was related to the fiscal rules. If you have that 3% of fiscal deficit to GDP, that mantra, that threshold ratio, then what will happen? Your capital expenditure will be curtailed because you're over-adjusting to the fiscal rules by curtailing your spending. So which spending will you curtail? Whether it's capital spending or the committed spending? Committed spending you can't curtail because it's committed. You need to perform. So when everything is going to the committed spending and your revenue deficit is not getting phased out, it's not zero, it's eating up your fiscal space, you over-adjust. You over-adjust to the fiscal rules by keeping the 3% threshold, by curtailing the capital spending. And over the years, we had it. We suffered. When the pandemic hit, we were at the receiving end, that the expenditure related to health sector, that's around 1%. Then, in the post-pandemic fiscal strategy, high deficits and high debt, we articulated that it is going to get linked to the capex. It's going to get linked into social infrastructure, social security, food security, and employer of last resort policies. And we framed a lot of cash transfers into the hands of women, energy infrastructure in gender budgeting, like providing clean fuel to the women in the low income households. That's a very crucial policy in the sense that indoor air pollution is the predominant determinant of the mortality rates among women and children, more than malaria. So do we need to look into these questions? And it is important from the just transition literature as well. As I mentioned earlier, the fiscal transition and energy transition are correlated, and the polycrisis model I have talked about, and within that, gender needs to get a place. So in that, fiscal consolidation is related to the energy transition. That is, we ask the state governments to keep fiscal deficit to GDP ratio from 3 to 3.5. And the extra borrowing of 3.5 is related to the power sector reforms. So within that, how do you want to place gender? How do you keep the gender into this narrative of polycrisis when the high fiscal deficit and the high debt is articulated by linking to capex? Within the capex, within the physical infrastructure, how do you apply a gender lens? If you look into the union budget two years prior, you can get an answer from climate change perspective. We floated climate bonds. Within the financing of deficit, we placed an earmarking and a thematic bond financing, and we placed climate bonds. And in Argentina, within this financing of fiscal deficit, you placed gender bonds. It's a thematic bond financing which is related to gender equality goals. Like that, you can get into this question of debt restructuring by incorporating the gender bonds. That is one plausibility. And what could be the other plausibilities by looking into this polycrisis in which you need to apply a gender lens when there is a war and macroeconomic crisis, when there is a macroeconomic uncertainty, when there is debt restructuring in which you think about financing of deficit with a thematic bond financing through gender bonds or climate bonds. Then you get into the energy transition literature. Energy transition, when you talk about just transition, you simply can't do a fossil to the non-fossil transition overnight. Why? Because there is a question of energy poverty. If you look into the numbers, if you look into the estimates of the time use statistics, this energy poverty issues you will be able to understand by getting into those issues. So when there is a lot of issues like that overnight, but at the same time, energy intensity is high for the Western world. So in COP28 in Dubai, we have to articulate this just transition by incorporating these concerns. We have to talk about energy poverty. We need to ask what are the external sources of financing for reaching the net zero level, rather than asking us to do this non-fossil fuel transition by when the energy poverty issues are real. So these are the questions in which, these are the new questions, when you write a book on gender budgeting, these are the new questions you need to ask about. These are the important questions. So like a beautiful public financial management framework, we have asked about the innovation phases, and those innovation phases are knowledge building or econometric, the model building, then the institutional mechanisms, state capacity building, and the accountability, in which you look into the fiscal marksmanship question. I have narrated how you can look into the randomness and the bias of the policymaker. Then you also have to ask a question about performance-linked budgeting, outcome budgeting, because once you look into the fiscal marksmanship, you will be able to understand the financial inputs, whether the promise is getting translated into the real spending. The next connect is from the spending to the outcomes. That's when we talk about outcome budgets and performance budget. What is that link to the outcomes? So these are the questions. And NIPFP, we have done outcome related expenditure tracking analysis for that biggest poverty linked microfinance program. We looked into the 6 banking sectors, 6 banking zones. That was one of the first ever expenditure tracking study done in the context of India or globally. That was in 2003 or 4. That time we went to the Indian villages. We looked into the questions of peer monitoring models, where the women, now the Nari Shakti, last budget, finance minister announced about this Nari Shakti and the peer monitoring models in which women form groups and open the bank account. Then they get the money from the banks to do the economic activity. They don't do anymore this Ponzi financing with indigenous money lenders, the bad lemons at high interest rate. They are linked to the good lemons. The market is not providing the government supported schemes. So these questions, whether it's heavenly or whether there is implementation issues or women facing issues. So these are the expenditure tracking analysis we have done on ground. And the inferences related to that accountability exercise, that was alarming. Like some cases, women were smart and they were not sincere, in the sense the formation of that peer monitoring models or the self-help groups model, that cohesiveness failed the moment they access the subsidy from the government. then everything fails. But most of the peer monitoring groups or the self-help groups, sincere groups. So you are sincere or strategic when you reveal the things. That's a part of public economics. You study that sincere or strategic because the public financing literature look into these questions in the mechanism design. Now, another model, women, they were sincere, they got money, they have savings, the transaction cost is reduced, then the savings they put as a group into the bank account, then bank gives equivalent amount of their savings, then with that money they do an economic activity, and through that they earn an income and they repay. But there is the lack of that statistical there is a statistical invisibility in the process. In Bangladesh, when the peer monitoring models were studied, there was a hitch. Like, there was intra household tension happened because the money was taken by women, but instead of putting that money to an economic activity, there was a tension in the household, like a male relative may ask that money. So when it comes to repayment, she hasn't done any economic activity. There was an intra-household bargaining issues or the power equations or the power relations, and things happen and she's stressed. When it comes to the repayment, she has to repay. So this intra-household bargaining power, how the government-run good lemon models lead to women's agency, and how that incorporate the empowerment in women and women do things. So this was another research, and even Dufflo's research, if you look into those questions, the Nobel winning literature, that randomized control experiments were also looked into from these perspectives, like immunization is free in our country. Can women take children to the immunization scams if you provide lentil? Why women are not coming up when immunization was completely free? That randomized control experiments were done. Then they looked into the question on the third year. We have, by constitutional amendment, we have 33% of participation of women. Thus, feminization of governance, can that lead to empowerment of women? Can that lead to the change in the public expenditure decisions favoring the revealed preferences of women? So these were the questions which were looked into in randomized control experiments. And we looked into the question of that intra-household bargaining power by looking into this, asking certain questions, or whether she's performing well. So otherwise, what will happen? She again get into the sponsor finance to repay that good lemon. That credit she got from the market, she's again approaching a money lender at very high interest rates, taking money to repay back. Why this Ponzi finance? So these are the questions which we can look into. Some students may would like to go to the fields and get the research, and MIT Action Lab, a poverty action lab, they look into these questions, and we have the randomized control trials. But of course there are methodological limitations to RCT which you are aware of, but that's one of the methodologies. So some students they get thrilled and they think that that's their call, like going to the villages, studying the issues rather than running regressions at the ivory tower. So there are different ways in which you can approach the problem of gender budgeting and gender related empowerment issues or the women empowerment issues. There are different methodologies for that. You can take a look into these methodologies. Maybe I stop here and look forward to your questions. I have a lot to speak because I have written a book. You can take a look into this book. I have not spoken everything, but take a look. You will enjoy my book. It's student friendly book. So the rest of the lecture, I fine tune to your requirements. Over to you for questions. Niharika, you can moderate the questions, and thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, very insightful, and you really went onto the basics so that everyone could understand. So, ma'am, in fact, confirming to what you were just talking about in terms of budgeting and understanding the dynamics of household in terms of finances. So this is something which we confirmed when we went to do a project for NABARD that was related to, we know that microfinance has gotten into the rural areas so much, and it has been one of the major factors that has helped women and for access.
I lost you. You're frozen. You're frozen, Niharika.
Oh, ma'am, am I audible now?
Yeah, now you are. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So, ma'am, when we went to do a project actually for NABARD to the rural areas, and we know that microfinance has really helped women and has made finance very accessible to them through bank linkage and so on. So they were taking most of the finances and loans which were taken through these, especially by the self-help groups, were for household consumptions rather than livelihood creation activities. And one, they were spent on children's education, which we consider to be a long-term investment. Of course, education does fall into that category. But most of it, ma'am, was for, daily household consumption.
Yeah.
One, we also maybe contributed to the fact that COVID was it had just passed. So we couldn't blame them, the household, and many of their husbands had lost jobs.
Okay.
But yes, what you were just saying, I so very can relate to it, given the ground experience. So I now invite, if anyone has questions, please let me know. Raise your hands.
Yeah, sure. Before that, Niharika,
Sure.
some of these inferences, that's documented in my book, but these are, precious inference, like, what you mentioned, that, it was not used for any, productive purpose, but the entitlement. And it's also related to the good mother question, good mother thesis, like
Yes.
the marginal income getting into the hands of a woman, that gets into the entitlement of children in terms of education and health, rather than getting into sin goods like alcohol or cigarettes or whatever it is, like if it gets into the hands of the men. These are good
Right.
method hypothesis that is, we have looked into. But one thing I would love to add to your, that
Sure.
insights, it's like when you talk about digital infrastructure. Of course, we have digital divide in our country. This peer monitoring models is good, but now with the digital infrastructure, there is another model. It's not like the peer monitoring that the self-help group, they open a bank account. Instead of that, the women have
Right.
direct access to the banks. They are bankable clients. So, but the digital infrastructure, if you look into the details, many of the things, you find that it is zero balance, things are not working out. But still, getting an access directly rather than forming a group and the group open the bank account. So that's a very good model, that digital infrastructure. And this digital infrastructure also needs to be looked into from the perspective of, crypto, CBDC. These are the new questions in which the gender budgeting can look into. Then we need to apply a gender lens into the digital money world. Like crypto, it's a high risk, a high return asset, but the women and men, they have they have different skills in taking up the risk. And if you are willing to get into this high risk, the return is higher. But unless you have a proper regulatory mechanism, you get into the phishing models or the bad coins. So that regulatory mechanism is very crucial. But crypto don't ban out, because it's an innovation in the money and finance. And in Rutgers, a student looked into this question of crypto, but there she looked into the question in the context of Rohingyas, in that refugee. But there, that anonymity, it was not used in a positive manner, but it was an anonymity that was helping using that digital money. Then CBDC, when you go to the legalized tender, instead of having the cash, if you go to the digitized legalized tender, will that help women? But of course, you have to think about no digital divide, that assumption. When there is no digital divide, that CBDC, which is now floated in different cities of India, whether CBDC and whether that what is the gender lens over there. So these are the different questions I thought it I will talk about when you address the question related to the cost of the credit and the access to the credit. cost of the credit we always dealt with by interest rate, differential interest rates. For women, we are getting into a differential interest rate, but women did policy finance at very high interest rates. Then you talked about access to the credit and how that credit was manipulated within the households, or how women use that credit instead of income generation but for entitlements for her children. So these are the inferences, and this will give new policy prescriptions. And over to students. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think Dr. Aditi has raised her hand. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Myself, Dr. Aditi. I am also working with Symbiosis School of Economics. I have a similar question as Dr. Niharika just asked, that we have a very much exposure to the field when we went to a NABARD project of understanding the MSMEs and their finances in Rajasthan. So we also had a similar experience, but the thing was that the public policy which was made, or the MSMEs which has a policy of having lower interest rates for the women entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
So what we observed was that the entrepreneurs or the organizations or the industries were registered in the name of the females of the house, right? But there was and it was like that for that reasons the government has not put up a condition that the women should be a higher education pass out, or a graduation pass out, or a post-graduation pass out. It was just that the entrepreneur should be a woman, right? So what we observed is that people have registered by them, but the females' conditions are the same as we have implemented these policies to improvising their livelihood, to improvise their lifestyle, to improvise their thought process, and to improvise their conditions in the economic system. But their conditions remains the same, and in the public policy eye, or in the GDP eye, or in the eye of calculation of the public or the government, that the women are increasing, or the women entrepreneurs are increasing in the country, that goes up. But the backdrop of that remains the same as we have studied before. So can't we have certain things, or do we get in public policy, can't we include certain things related to education, related to the digital divide which we face?
Absolutely.
Kind of
Yes. Go ahead. Aditi, you have shared your question. You have something else to add to it?
No, I think, ma'am, she is done with her question.
Acha, Aditi,
Yes.
thank you so much. And this inference, I own that inference. Like, overnight we can't make women micro entrepreneurs. Financial empowerment through the government run, that NABARD exercise you have done, it was tough. You understood that women were unable, because education, skills, these were, or the how to maintain the finance accounts, these skilling were not given to the entrepreneurs. So when you think about the public policy perspective and the competence which that gaps you identified from the field, this feedback needs to be given to the the government, that certain things need to be given importance, like skilling. That's very important. Otherwise, these exercises can give women empowerment, but not financial empowerment, but social empowerment, because they are coming out from the homes, they are forming the groups, they're talking among them. That socializing process can give some kind of a social empowerment, but not financial empowerment. And do we need to conclude that these schemes which were aimed at the economic empowerment of women, that's just getting vanished through giving? Social empowerment is of course valuable, but we need to go ahead more than that. So that inference is very well taken. And Rajasthan, you shared your experience, let me share my experience. I went to as a part of this study, I went to Sri Ganganagar. Sri Ganganagar was the border district of Pakistan and Rajasthan.
Yes. Pakistan and Rajasthan.
Pakistan and Rajasthan. And there were a lot of, you've been to Sri Ganganagar as well?
That was there in our list, but because of the border tension, it was again taken back, and we were given these Bikaner as one of the district other than Sri Ganganagar.
Okay.
It was first there in our list, but because
Sure.
of during that time certain border issues were going on.
Sure.
So it was taken back and Bikaner was given in
Okay.
place of that.
Okay. So it was like a multiplied that what do you call the sampling and all. You select certain units, but at the last time in that sampling methodology, you need to replace because of the exogenous factors. That's well taken. In Ganganagar, two things I understood. One is they are in Vale, but it doesn't.
Yes.
Yeah, but the thing is that they were not like they were not lacking any agency. Like they were very powerful. They may be having that veil, but the decision making ability of these women, that was commendable. It was like a system that they are with that. So that was commendable. Second thing, there were no good civil society organizations, because in the Indian villages where civil society organizations were there, they could help catalyzing the people to come and form groups. So there were no civil society organizations in Sri Ganganagar to form the groups of the people. There were no cohesive group. So that was another thing that bank officials are telling whom to give. We can't do it for the individual woman. They have to form a group and certain criteria is there. So we are unable to transfer. So unutilized. When you do the accountability exercise, why the money is unutilized? When you look into this fiscal marksmanship issue, why there is a gap between what is promised and what is delivered? That's a lack of capacity, and there were no groups formed. Another one, groups are there, they formed, and it's a beautiful that embroidery, like they make the shoe like the Pakistani, you get in Fab India, that embroidery, that leather shoes, right? So they were making that, but the government or the banks, they were unable to transfer these funds which were designed for the self-help groups, because these women were from Pakistan and they were not Indian citizens. So then Vasuntara, she was having that issues related to how many citizenship, that question of giving. Now with the Aadhaar and this identity card and all, I don't know whether, because I have been revisited to that. So these are the exogenous factors they were facing in forming the groups. Once they formed the groups, whether as they didn't have the citizenship, then they didn't have the Aadhaar code or anything, then this money was not given to them. The issues were many, but in Andhra Pradesh, where civil society organizations were there, in South Indian villages, these micro entrepreneurs, they were doing a good job. But in Rajasthan, in Bongaigaon in Assam, that's another village we have gone, in the tribal villages, it was a kind of a different style. Like if the men, it's like the money were given to the men's group as well. Self-help group, it's not like prima facie it's only women. Men's group, and what they did a credit layering. We call in the credit literature, it's credit layering. Instead of doing the business, they did some kind of a business by just giving money to their friends and relatives at a high interest rate, and they are paying back. They are not defaulters, but the basic purpose of this money, it's not served. So these were the inferences that please don't do that. This is not the purpose. In the mixed group also, we were asked to inform them that this is not the way. But when the credit rating comes, the women in the self-help groups, they were unable to form that finance accounts or anything to maintain that. Lack of skilling. But men's group repayment is high. But we know that the secret is not through an economic activity of the formation. So these inferences were found, and we told that things are not sincere but quite strategic as well. Then a lot of stories, it's like when we a lot of I don't exercise my power in telling stories right now. I look forward to the questions from students, and then I will this is an interesting field which we can look into further questions. And thanks for that feedback by Niharika and Aditi. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Vimarsh, you had raised your hand. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, ma'am. First of all, good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Vimarsh. I'm also a student at Symbiosis School of Economics, BSc second year. It was a pleasure listening to you. My question to you is regarding the advent of digital public goods, such as UPI. and like how the increasing digitization of the financial and banking sector have bridged the institutional and policy level gaps. Do you think that they have helped in helping out the financial mission of women, and it is on a path to resolution?
Sure. Your name is Nihar. Who asked the question? Bimal. Okay, thank you. Bimal, your question is related to the digital infrastructure, right? And how it's helping the women. Yeah, a part of it I addressed when I talked about that Niharika's question. But we need to ask a question: a digital dollar or digital rupee, whether that leads to financial inclusion. What's the role of the digital dollar or a digital currency in financial inclusion? So globally, this question was looked into. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, if you look into that paper by Barry Aitken Green, he talked about this digital dollars and financial inclusion. So your question of the gentleness into the digital currency can be looked into from the perspective of financial inclusion, whether it's helping women. So the answer given by Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, is that especially in the times of pandemic, that digital dollar, it really helped in the sense she had some pandemic checks to be circulated, and she also believed that the of course if there is no digital divide, it was crucial for her to translate that basic income into the hands of the people through that digital method. So those things are fine. But there are a lot of data privacy issues. There are a lot of transparency issues when the entrepreneur is doing the cross-border transactions. Whether you are protected, whether there is a regulatory framework, or whether you get into fraudulence. So these regulatory framework needs to be given by the government rather than saying no to these digital assets. That's one thing. So you have two issues. One is that decentralized finance, the blockchain methodology, and you get into the crypto and all, where you feel that it is little unsafe. But you tax that world, right? 2 years back, finance minister mentioned that it is taxed at 30%, because she considered that digital world as a speculative asset. It's not a digital currency, but a speculative asset, where she taxed it at 30%, because any speculative assets like horse race, casino, everything we tax at 30%. So crypto she taxed at 30%, but taxing it doesn't make it legitimate. That's the way she explained. And we expected that there will be a regulatory framework. And the G20 meetings also, we articulated, along with climate change, debt restructuring, etc. This crypto, this digital currency world was given importance, as how to do that. The global or the cross-border regulatory mechanisms in which women or men entrepreneurs can do things with ease without getting into fraudulence. Those things still we need to tackle. That's one world. The other one, digital, when we talk about, of course, in the digital world, this ghost beneficiaries, they are deleted. They are no longer there, because digital means you need to have a particular person and a particular digital linked account for that money to be transferred. So lot of cleansing happened within the public spending when we went digital. That was a good thing. Like the ghost beneficiaries are not there. Now the third issue is the JAM, Jantan, that Aadhaar, all those linking business, whether that is helping women. And the inferences from the field is limited, or it is mixed, in the sense, your question, the way you asked me, that of course you are aware of the digital divide, then how it's going to help women. So we need to understand that the digital infrastructure in public finance matters only when we do that digital divide, when we work out with the digital divide concerns, because the access to the smart mobile, how many women in our country have a smart thing, and how many women have that access to internet or access to, so these are the questions, and once we tackle that, then we can go digital, then we can think that the digital currency and financial inclusion are related. So this is an area of research, whether the digital currency is leading to the financial inclusion, and financial inclusion in the sense that it is not only talked from that perspective of poor getting included into the banking system, but also the inclusiveness in terms of the cross-border transactions, and also in helping the women entrepreneurs. So there are different ways in which we can look into this question, and it is a very new area of research, and we need to get into that from the access more, because it's not about the cost or the liquidity guidance or anything, but it has to be talked from the access. And how RBI, you have worked with NABARD, how RBI looked into this question needs to be analyzed in detail, because in the pandemic times, liquidity guidance was given importance along with keeping the interest rate at the lower level, in which we kept repo rate at 4 for a long time. Recently, when there was a mounting global inflation, we start increasing the repo rates, but rising the interest rate, but it is not differential way. Differential interest rates for the women entrepreneurs, that's one thing, but that's not the best way to handle. The other way, the instrument, the toolkits of the the monetary policy is what you talked about, is the credit, is a liquidity guidance. So they were targeted repo rate operations to look into the stressed sectors. So how can we do this gentle lens, or apply gentle lens over there in the targeted repo rate transactions? And third thing is, when we look into that pattern of the funds within the bank, a certain portion is SLR. That's a statutory liquidity ratio which needs to be maintained by the bank. Then we do the bond financing, and that the market oriented business happens at certain level. Then comes the priority sector lending, 40% we need to maintain. Climate change was looked into from this priority sector lending. We incorporated a green lens or a climate within the priority. Gender lens will also be incorporated like that. But in the bond financing, gender bonds or the climate bonds, that will happen. Then SLR we can't touch, because that's the statutory liquidity ratio that needs to be maintained. So we need to look into the questions, what are the different toolkits, and from the climate perspective, what they have done, they got into this political economic questions of applying the stress test. Like if you have a mitigation, adaptation, everything, you look into climate related risk and uncertainties, you need to get into the stress test, because this climate related risk and uncertainties affect your financial stability. So you look into that. You look into the NPA question, non-performing assets, by looking at the stress test. So that's a way ECB, the European, central bank, Bank of England, they got into greening of monetary policies. But your question is much more wider, by putting the human development issues, by putting a gentle lens into the financial inclusion, into the digital currency. So that's another world, and you need to come from a different way, but not from that differential interest rates. It has to be from the liquidity guidance. So the toolkits are it's evolving, but we have not yet spoken a gentle lens in the monetary policy. If you know in any country where the monetary policy authorities have spoken about gentle, please inform me. I will keep myself updated. But I don't know. Because now if you look into the fiscal policy, everything looks so normal. In 2000, when I began the research, it was not like, people used to look at what weird things you're talking about. But now it's so normal. But central bank governor or a central bank chair in any country started talking about gender issues. How they looking to the monetary macro through a gentle lens? These are the questions which waits champions, to look into these issues. Yes. the students can start thinking about it and start writing. And some of the elements I have spoken to you, so you can explore that and develop those issues like what do you call it, the interest rate differentials, liquidity guidance, the other toolkits, how the climate is looked into, how you can do the quantification of gender. So these are the different things. You're closer to RBI than me, so you can take a look into these questions from there. Yeah.
Ma'am, just adding on to one point, I don't know how much, but what we came across was some of the countries, especially these Scandinavian countries like Finland and Netherlands and so on, they have in some way included gender budgeting in their public policy. And I haven't found out or tried to find out the relationship between the development or the gender outcomes, because that is what you just mentioned, and then we thought that yes, this is something that we can figure out econometrically as well. But yes, we know that in terms of gender outcomes, they are much better than the other countries, and they have lesser gender gaps, and also they have included gender budgeting in their public policies. So then that leads to one very important question that you have mentioned in your lecture, to find out the relationship econometrically and prove that there is a relationship between the two. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Niharika. Thank you for reminding me that Scandinavian country. I want to just add to your point. Like in Scandinavian countries, why that beautiful public policy, that revolution happened? Because they thought that what do you call the autonomous individual concept. And I talk this to students like, how many policymakers or how many policymaking authorities can integrate or incorporate the concept of autonomous individual. What you talked about the Scandinavian countries, Niharika, that public policy revolution happened because they accepted that autonomous individual concept into the policy making. Like the people, they are fundamentally independent of each other. And in Scandinavian countries, people in the care economy live with dignity by state machinery supporting them. But in India, you can't imagine that. And econometrically, we can look into that question later. But that statistical invisibility of the unpaid, unmonetized care economy. But in Scandinavian countries, the policies related to the care economy, that's not invisible. That's there. Exactly what you have mentioned. That why there is a close connect between the gender budgeting policies and the gender outcomes, because they take that care economy infrastructure seriously. The old people, now I came to Kerala, that's why I am talking from my home, with my mother. I'm staying here. I came here as state guest to Trivandrum to participate in the Keralium. It's a big festival going on in Kerala, and I came as a state guest, and I asked the government, please delay my travel. I won't be able to go back immediately because my world stopped. My mother fell down and she's living alone. So what is that market-based solution or the state-based solution in which I can get a help so that I can go back to work, support my mom? Is there any digital infrastructure in which I can immediately get a call that, I need, trustworthy help? I need help. So is there something? Agencies, private, market-based solution are around. But can I leave my mom to the market-based solution and go back to Delhi and start working? Will I be comfortable? Will she be comfortable? Because will she sleep? If somebody extra, which we don't know, but there are agencies and we call them. And what is a care economy solution or infrastructure in which women of this country feel comfortable to leave their kid, to leave their ailing relatives, to leave their parents? The demographic transition is happening now. In Kerala, it's like aging. In many countries, the demographic transition is there, and public financial lens, even from the gender perspective, needs to look into demographic transition issues. Demographic dividend, we enjoy that now. But in certain states in India, there is a demographic transition, and these issues are becoming very relevant. And I have spoken this in that meeting where the finance minister is there, and he told that now you are highlighting this issue, of course, from your personal perspective, but as a state, we are going to face this issue, and we need to think right now that what are the ways in which we can support this. And of course it is not like entirely subsidized. He was thinking that we can have a cross subsidy model, because all the families, they require a person whom we can trust, but they have willingness to pay. But in certain families, they don't have willingness to pay, but where from that earning capacity. But this is a huge issue, and in our country, the care economy infrastructure, we have designed 2 years leave for the child care, and women, we can breathe now, because otherwise many talented people, after these passions, after doing the knife edge studies and all, very good professionals, they take a call and support their family. They move out of the labor market. So if the smartest and the fastest way to increase the GDP, look into the statistical invisibility of the care economy infrastructure, employer of last resort policies, guaranteeing jobs, that didn't work wonders. There were gender differentials just because we are not addressing the care economy infrastructure. So maybe Kerala will come as a good model. In Pune, I know that there are many private models existing, but Maharashtrian government, will they come up with a good model, the care economy, a comprehensive care economy package? That's what is lacking in India. And we need to think about those issues. And Scandinavian countries are much ahead, because take a look into the Swedish theory of love. That's a documentary which projects the Niharika's issues, that how the Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden, has looked into this question. And that documentary starts with that acceptance of Niharika, that it is a public policy revolution that has happened in the Northern Europe, when the public policy makers realized and accepted that the fundamental independence between each other, that's the basis for a dignified life and economic well-being. And that should be the next level of gender budgeting, of the public policy revolution, in which the women of our country should own this gender budgeting as their tool of empowerment. And it is a political economy question, and good leaders will find that how the gender budgeting can incentivize the calculus of consent in the next elections. So it's a political economy question, and we need to wait and see whether the gender budgeting from that political economy model will go as an election issue and incentivize the calculus of consent. It's a public choice theory as well. This is another stream of literature which students can look into, and I stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Samriddhi?
Okay. Good afternoon to one and all. On behalf of Symbiosis School of Economics, I, Samriddhi Khare, as Student Council President, have the distinct honor and privilege to express a heartfelt gratitude to respected Lekha ma'am. I would like to express a sincere appreciation for this guest lecture. Ma'am, your insights, wisdom and knowledge have left an incredible mark, especially the macroeconomic framework and the current issues about gender budgeting have been very, very insightful for all of us. First and foremost, I would also like to express our deepest gratitude to respected Director Ma'am for her unwavering support and encouragement to make this lecture a reality. We are also thankful to Sudeepa Ma'am for her commitment and dedication to the Institute. And she always sets an example for us, and we thank you for your presence today, ma'am. Next, a special mention must go to Niharika ma'am for hosting this event. Her efforts have contributed to a smooth flow of an event. I would also like to acknowledge the tireless efforts of the dedicated faculty members, and a heartfelt thank you to the IT team for working diligently behind the scenes for a seamless execution of this event. Last but not the least, we are thankful to every single person present here and our esteemed guests. And thank you for taking out the time today, ma'am. And your presence has genuinely added value to our academic endeavors.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and all the best to you. Thank you, Niharika.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. We can stop recording, please, and end the meeting. A very good afternoon to everyone. I'm truly honored to welcome you all to this session on gender budgeting. In a world striving for inclusivity and gender equality, this discussion couldn't be more timely or vital. Gender budgeting is not just a financial endeavor, it is a commitment to promoting fairness and justice in the society. In a broader context, it's about acknowledging that budgets aren't gender neutral. They have the power to either perpetuate or alleviate gender based disparities. Today, we will explore the profound impact of gender responsive budgeting, a concept that demands our attention and action. Gender budgeting ensures that government spending and fiscal policies are examined through a gender lens. It seeks to understand how different policies and allocations impact men and women differently. By identifying and addressing the specific needs and challenges faced by various genders, we can create a more equitable and just society. For this, we would like to invite none other than Professor Lekha Chakraborty. Ma'am is a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi, which is a research institute of Ministry of Finance. She is an elected member of the Governing Board of Management, International Institute of Public Finance, Munich. She is a pioneer economist in institutionalizing gender budgeting in India with Chief Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, Government of India in 2004. She is also a research affiliate at the Lev Economics Institute of Bard College, New York. She's the recipient of Infosys Best PhD Thesis Award from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Ma'am has worked for various international institutes of repute like IMF, ILO, the World Bank, UNDP, UN Women, and so on. Her work experience on macro fiscal policy and human development spans across 8 countries and more, including Sweden, Canada, Morocco, the Philippines, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Mexico, and more frequently in the South Asian or Asian Pacific region. Ma'am is she was twice an awardee of the Shastri Indo-Canadian program from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.